We are very interested in the ways in which an academic housing researcher like myself can collaborate with a practitioner, an architect who is actually creating the buildings that are serving the people who have the greatest housing vulnerability. And so we've worked on these different ways to do this. And I think what's resulted has been, for Amanda, very evidence-based buildings, and for me, a much more meaningful research practice and teaching practice. So a week from today, Amanda will join me in my classroom to talk about these same issues with my students, to try to work on the next generation of socially conscious designers going into this field. So Amanda, I'll hand it over to you.
Right. Well, I'm Amanda D'Onofrio. I am a principal at BDA Architecture and Planning in Eugene, Oregon. And, really what's kind of interesting about this relationship with Christina, obviously, she said we've known each other a long time and have been friends. When I was first working on this work, I was really a project architect and project manager at the firm. And so as I was working on our first PSH project, I shifted into becoming a partner and principal at the firm. And so it was really wonderful that before making that shift, I had had the time in a firm of 5 people to actually be able to dig into research with somebody. And I am so pleased to be in an ownership role and continue to make that a priority for our small firm. Christina and I could go on about the benefits of research and practitioner partnerships. So if anybody wants to reach out about that later, we'll make sure we shift into what we're here to talk to you about today, which is trauma-informed design. We're specifically going to talk to you about how we learned about trauma-informed design going back 5+ years, and developed a series of patterns that we've incorporated into. We're going to focus on common spaces today, but we do also have a series of patterns we've incorporated into units as well. We're mostly going to focus on showing you the Commons on MLK and the NEL, which are 2 projects in Eugene, Oregon, which BDA Architecture and Planning was the design firm for. But we also have incorporated along the way other permanent supportive housing projects that we studied and learned from that exemplified these patterns that we developed through our research. This is one of those moments where it's like you're going to click and wait. And then if I do it again, it's probably going to go forward too much. So bear with me. There we go. All right. So, as Christina mentioned, it was pretty much, I think it was even back in 2017 when I started to work on our first Housing First PSH project for BDA. And I knew that this was going to be a very different type of project than anything we had done before. What I failed to mention is that we are a small firm that specializes in multifamily affordable housing. And so we had this whole portfolio of affordable housing to work on. Knew PSH would be different and didn't really know how, but we knew that common area was going to be part of that. And so, having a friend who was a housing researcher, I went to her and asked this question. And so, she had found evidence that, multifamily market rate housing has a net rentable area target of around 82% of gross building area. And, when we went and we're looking at affordable housing, we found this similar metric of 70 to 75%, which is also what calculated out in similar, again, single site buildings that my firm had done. And we didn't really know what that PSH number would be. And so we were not only curious for ourselves, but we also knew that if there was going to be more common area in this building typology, that having evidence to point to was going to help our owners, our state's housing department, and potential funders when justifying having less net rentable area in these housing projects.
So with some assistance from some grad students I was working with at the time, we studied 12 permanent supportive housing buildings in great detail across the US and Canada. We started with a much wider net, probably looking at about 30 or so, and then narrowed down to 12 from different regions to make sure geographically we were getting some understanding, and then also different ages so that we could understand, like, has this common area grown over the last 10 years? So Amanda and I, with these grad students, analyzed the floor plans and the photographs to understand how each common area that we saw on the plans was actually being used. We calculated the floor area of each of these and then traced paths to the diagrams to understand how the space was layered. So, you know, how do you enter the building? How do you move through it? Where are the elevators? Where are the stairs? These kind of issues. And here on this slide, you can see basically what is our analyzed data. So these are the color-coded floor plans of the buildings. Green is outdoor space that is accessible by the residents and staff. Blue are common spaces, the darker blue, especially for gathering. And then the lighter blue it gets, the smaller the room is for gathering. So from a big common area down to little spaces, maybe for a meeting. And then the yellow color are the offices for social service providers in the building. So these are dedicated office spaces. So we did this for each of the 12 projects. And then we took these calculations, and then, of course, we needed also the gross area of the building, so the space dedicated to the apartments themselves. And we found that the PSA projects that we studied ranged from 33 to 64% net residential area, with a mean of 54%. So what that implies is that these buildings have significantly more common area than a typical affordable housing project. And some of that is in these dedicated social service spaces, but also in the common areas as well. There are many more common areas in PSH than there are in affordable housing, which might just have like one nice big common area room for like a kid's birthday party or to use for a meeting. In PSH, we saw many different common areas. So we've done a little bit more work on this and we'd be happy to share it with you. But mostly today we wanted to set a sort of a baseline to establish that there is much more in PSH than affordable housing. And so that then you have a context for why we're studying this issue and how it can be more trauma responsive.
Yeah, absolutely, Christina. Just kind of building on that, right? That these projects have more common area, and therefore there was this real intention to making sure that these spaces that we're creating for people to be together are more trauma responsive and and create a sense of safety and security. And so, you know, what this slide is actually showing us is we started to do the same analysis on our the project we were designing, the Commons on MLK, that first PSH project we did, and when we actually did that same ratio of net to gross, we came up to 54%, which was right in the mean of what our precedent projects had presented. And so in the remaining part of the building is all of this common area, which you can see is largely located on the ground floor in our case, in which we incorporated these trauma-informed design patterns that we're going to move into discussing today.
So my guess is for this particular group, from what we understand from Joanna, the idea of trauma-informed care is likely not a new concept for you. So I just want to have one slide so that you can know where we're coming from this. So trauma-informed care had its genesis in the 1970s as U.S. service members returned from Vietnam, but it's really been used as a framework by social workers in this particular field of housing deprivation since 2001. And the way we're approaching it is on these five words on the left-hand side of the slide. The idea of understanding and recognizing and responding to the effects of all different types of trauma. So these are our core words from the research. And both Amanda and I, had heard this from social workers involved in the projects we were designing as we went along. So we started from that perspective. We didn't start from design and try to figure this out. We started from the idea of trauma-informed care and went from there. So in the diagram here, this is kind of for me, this is the really strong motivation to do this work. So we know that trauma can be literally a cause of homelessness, that there's a huge correlation between having childhood trauma or early adulthood trauma and the incidence of homelessness, especially homelessness that lasts for a long period of time. We also know that experiencing homelessness, unsheltered or sheltered, results in another form of trauma, the trauma of not having stable housing. And so this kind of multiplicable effect, this is almost double jeopardy, right? Is a really high motivator for me personally. This is why we need to be thinking about trauma and being responsive to trauma in the design for housing that is designed as permanent supportive housing.
And so the trauma-informed care model is aiming to provide a sense of safety and empowerment, and we're recognizing that the building needs to support this mission for the residents who've experienced previous trauma and the staff whose role it is to be available for those residents. So, to incorporate trauma informed care into the design of a building, we could see that we needed to understand what design elements may be triggers for trauma and to better understand the mental health impacts of design choices. So, we attempted to make design decisions that would minimize stress and increase feelings of safety. And we could also see that we would need to engage with people who had lived experience of homelessness to provide perspective on how to respond to the trauma of long-term homelessness in design. The more that we were learning about trauma-informed care, the more we understood the importance of that work being tenant-led. And we felt that to be trauma-informed in the design, it was important for our design process to include these representative voices for future tenants. And so some of the questions we were asking ourselves are here on the screen, right? Just how can a building respond to the impact of trauma, emphasizing physical, psychological, and emotional safety for providers and survivors? How can the building respond to the need for opportunities to rebuild a sense of control and empowerment? And then how do we take these 5 words and create patterns that are replicable in design?
So we learned that one organization, so this is back in 2017, 2018, and I will say that much to my great joy, trauma-informed design is a very different field than it was back in 2018, 2019. When we first started doing this work, Amanda and I could only find 2 trauma-informed design principles, like sets of principles related to design. One was from the University of Florida, and the other is from the Committee on Temporary Shelter, which is located in Vermont. These were the only 2 organizations that publicly talked about trauma-informed design. And so looking through these and trying to understand how they may be adapted from being for temporary shelter into something that was permanent housing. That was one of our tasks, was to combine these, to synthesize them, and to make them more applicable for the design of housing. And we were also, because we're both interested in many forms of housing, many forms of affordable housing, we were also thinking, how can they be adapted generally for housing instead of for a more institutional setting like shelter? So in that synthesis, these are the principles that we came up with for trauma-informed design, again, borrowing heavily from these other resources. Now, I'm just so happy to see so many other people kind of in this space around trauma-informed design, and you can find it from everything from schools to behavioral health, to even to the way we interface with technology. And so it's a much more varied field than it was back then. So these are our trauma informed design principles, and our next task then was to bridge into trauma-informed design patterns. And what we mean by patterns is that we can take multiple principles and combine them into something that is actionable for a designer, that's actionable by a developer or someone working on a rehab of a building, to make it more trauma-informed for the people, or trauma responsive rather, for the people who are moving into the space. So we're going to step through each of these principles one at a time. And with work, Amanda has work from her, images from her projects that have used these patterns to illustrate the patterns. And we're going to start with this first one, which is to connect common areas, common area spaces with windows. We're always kind of configuring these depending on our audience. So sorry for just making sure I knew which one was the next one there. So depending on the audience, we sometimes start with different patterns. So the first one I think is one of the most powerful, which is to connect common areas, spaces with windows. And by windows, we mean windows on the inside of the building, not just looking outside, which is important, but also between spaces.
So I will launch right into taking us to the Commons on MLK and the Nell. And so at these projects, all of the residential common areas feature either an interior light or glazing in the entry door. And so this is allowing the residents to see inside of a room before they enter, which is allowing the choice to understand what is happening inside of a room before deciding to engage, which can help reduce anxiety. And this is also allowing for staff to take stock of situations inside of rooms and consider how to engage that's in a way that's going to best ensure safety for staff and residents. And so at these projects, we've co-located the laundry room with a common area lounge and provided windows that are connecting the lounge into the laundry room. And so this is so that people are, when they're doing their laundry, especially people have moved into housing out of living in homelessness, and you have a very strong tie to the possessions that you do have, that strong visual connection into the laundry room allows people to know what's going on inside, who's going in there, and feel a little bit more of a sense of security about their belongings in that space.
Before you move on from that slide, Amanda, I think this is a great time to point out that you did these buildings consecutively. So there was the first building, the MLK, is on the left. The second building, the Nell, is on the right. And you were able to develop kind of even more visibility in the Nell, knowing kind of working through the pattern once on the first building and developing it kind of at the same time, the pattern, then implementing it as a trauma responsive pattern on the second building. So I think this is a really nice illustration of how you've been able to incorporate more and more of these into the building.
Yeah, thank you for that reminder too. It's like these buildings, I sort of refer to them as siblings because, the Commons on MLK was completed in January of 2021, right around the time we were submitting the NEL for a building permit. And so as the Commons on MLK was occupied, we were actually getting real-time lessons learned about things that were working and things that weren't. And, as some of us know, you know, construction still allows you the opportunity to make some changes and make some improvements. And so we were able to make some modifications based on things that worked and things that we felt either worked well and we wanted to do more of, or things that we needed to adjust because there's lots of lessons learned positive and some things that needed improvement. And so you'll kind of see that throughout this presentation. A lot of these images are side by side with MLK on the left and then L on the right, kind of following on the heels. So this is actually featuring on the left a project called Plymouth First Hill, which Joanna is very familiar with up in Seattle. And then the Nell is on the right. These are projects that both have like a reception and property management space located right by the front door of these buildings. And these spaces feature transaction windows, which not only allow for that visual connection, but then provides this next level ability to slide open the door, whether that's because the property manager wants to hear what's going on as people are passing by, or or somebody's there to have a conversation. It's allowing for both passive and active interaction with residents. And, so much of what we're trying to do is provide these opportunities for the building of trust between staff and residents, as well as always creating a sense of control and safety and security.
So our second pattern is to provide common areas that maximize resident choice. And this pattern was able to combine the care principles of safety and choice, but then also the design principles of providing spaces for safe conversations for clients and staff, between clients and clients, staff and clients, to provide and promote choice for social engagement and to mitigate sensory overload, but still allow for sensory delight. And so that particular trauma-informed design principle is about making sure that spaces aren't too overwhelming for someone to actually use them. If we're going to be designing 54% of the building as common area, we want to make sure that the people who live there are comfortable using the spaces and aren't totally overstimulated when they enter. So this is, Amanda, you're way better about talking about this. I know you.
Sure.
I was like, wait a second, this isn't my slide. This is, I mean, it is pretty amazing the way, again, I would say you were able to move from the lessons learned at MLK into the NEL. And I think that especially the slide on the right of the NEL is going to really get to that point.
Sure. So, really at the Commons on MLK and at the NEL, we were providing multiple types and sizes of common areas, but wanting to create spaces for really flexible programming within these. And so, at these buildings, we had a lounge, which was more like a TV room, and a library and games. While then there was this sort of separate community room, more akin to what Christina described in the beginning, which was the space where in family housing it's the kids' birthday party. In PSH, a lot of holiday cooking is happening in that community room. It's a space where food donations, where Food for Lane County sets up in the main community room, but there's also art therapy or yoga or nutrition discussions happening in that space. And then there's a third common area where we've kept the computer lab separately in both of these projects as well. And so it was really intentional in the projects that we provide common area on the first floor that was activating this part of the building and then allowing for staff observation and interaction, because we wanted to make spaces for social engagement that could be organized or could happen casually and fit residents' changing needs as their moods and their preferences shift. Outside of each unit at the residential floor, this image that you see on the right is this common nook, which is near the elevator lobby. Because even though it was really intentional for the team to have all of the common area on the ground floor and have choice in that common area, um, they wanted people to have space outside of their small dwelling units to be able to connect with one another or just sort of sit and see what was going on and watch other people without having to go down to the first floor. Is there anything you want to add to that one, Christine, before I move on?
No, that's good. Thanks. And I think the next one, yeah, the next one is kind of a contrast between two really different kinds of spaces. So I would say that what Amanda's been doing has been trying to maximize resident choice, but still within the budgets, right? That PSH requires and the ability for staff to oversee these spaces. On the left, at the kind of one end of the spectrum is Sanderson Apartments in Denver, Colorado, which is a building with maybe the most common area of any of the buildings that we have studied in PSH. There's so many different rooms in this project. And one thing that's really interesting is even when on the image on the left, even when there's just one room, you can see that there are choices within that room. So there's a kitchen here that was intended as a training kitchen, but is used more as like a warming kitchen for food during football games and things. And that kitchen is still within the same room as the TV and the green chairs that you see all the way at the end by the windows, but that one room functions almost as two rooms. And this is something that's really common when you're doing a trauma-informed renovation of a space. So on the right is a Plymouth housing project in Seattle that went through a very intentional trauma-informed renovation in which they took a quite small room in an existing in an existing building and divided it into little zones. And so there's a zone for watching TV, there's a zone for making phone calls, a zone for puzzles. And they tried to separate these as much as possible through the use of furniture, through the use of color. So at both ends of the spectrum, a $5,000 renovation on the right and a multi-million-dollar building on the left, we're still using kind of this spatial differentiation to give to maximize choice for residents.
Do you want to talk about this one or do you want me to?
Yeah, I appreciate that. It's always more fun for me personally to hear about your buildings from you than for me to narrate your buildings. So I'm going to step back. When we see MLK and Nell slides, I'm going to say, I want to hear the newest things that you can tell me about this
Okay.
project, Amanda.
Well, then I think, what I would say about this is, so we talked about this particular pattern starting inside of the building, but it's really important to recognize that this particular pattern can be happening outside of the building as well and can be applied to your outdoor spaces. Outdoor space and connection to outdoor space is so important in permanent supportive housing. And so each of these buildings, the Commons and MLK and the Nell, featured a courtyard, and the big L shape of these buildings was screening this courtyard from neighboring buildings as well. So it was providing a lot of sort of dignity and privacy to this common outdoor area for the building. And so we introduced this notion of landscape rooms into both of these courtyards, which include the opportunity and the choice to sit under cover or not. There's garden beds to sink your hands into. At the MLK, we did a water feature. um, the Nell is actually in a more urban intersection in Eugene, and the Commons on MLK was sited on Lane County's behavioral health campus. And so we have really different site conditions here, which allowed us at the Commons on MLK to create a front porch, which was another option for access to the outdoors and sort of this beginning of screening from public to semi-public to private to semi-private. As you kind of move through space. And, really, as we're understanding the importance of access to nature, as we're learning more about, trauma informed design, particularly for people who have experienced chronic homelessness in this transition into housing, the outdoor courtyards were a main programmatic element. And so in both of them, our main common areas exit directly onto this space. At the Commons on MRK, our quiet room, which was a space for de-escalation, exited right to the courtyard. And then we have visual connections from all of these common residential areas, common staff spaces, are looking out, and that sense of in the same way that we think of eyes on the street, having eyes on this courtyard enhances that feeling of safety for people who are choosing to use it. So, our next pattern is to supply a visible central third stair at the project. And so this wants to be, it's an irresistible stare for multiple reasons. One being in its location, and then one being in giving stairs a little more attention, because when we were talking with people, we'd heard that crevices or spaces that felt dark and shadowy, including stairwells, could trigger previous trauma, as they could have been predatory places in somebody's past. And so we knew that we wanted to be making our stairs more appealing and make them safe spaces to encourage their use. And so in both the Commons on MLK and the Nell, we have a third stair that's open at the ground floor that's encouraging use and further enhancing feelings of safety by not enclosing it at the main level. So this is, in our case, it's a stairwell that actually connects all 4 floors of a 4-story building. And at the upper residential floors, which you can kind of start to see right here, each door has a vision light, but then there are these really pretty sizable glazing panels that are allowing residents and staff to see who's using the stairwell much more easily before going into it. And so these are images. We put the Nell on a separate slide, you know, because it's one of my favorite things about these two buildings is not only did, they come one right after another, but I have a very, very positive and longstanding relationship with this client. And so they continue to bring back lessons learned and allow me to visit the building. And so, um, we had gone, I think it was maybe around this time last year, even, when the building had been occupied for about half a year, and walked with the property manager and the service provider. And they were sharing with us the importance of this central stair. Um, for everyday use, and not only everyday use, but particularly in events like a fire alarm that goes off in the building. And so this is the stair that staff uses to get up into the most central part of the building when the elevator goes down. Because, what you can see here is we've got, our bank of two elevators, and we've got this third stair. And the exit stairs of our building, one of them goes into this residential common area, but the other goes right outside. So, property manager, service providers are just running up this stair to be most central in an upper floor, and disperse where they're needed in case of an event. And so we paid a lot of attention to the third stair, but I think the other thing is, remembering that trying to treat all stairs, as irresistible and increasing feelings of safety and giving attention to them. This is one of our exit stairs in the project. And, we've got natural light coming in at the level landings and at the intermediate landings, and are using color to soften what otherwise could be a stark white stairwell.
I actually think the examples you have now, Amanda, are so much stronger than these examples from Cambridge. But these images are a project Amanda and I visited back in 2019 in New York, and in the Bronx. And there's a stair. It's not a full building height third stair. It just connects the main lobby level with the lower social service level. But it's it has many of these characteristics of being very open, and having another way for people to get down into the social service spaces, and also get back up to the lobby, the main social spaces, the main congregate spaces of the building. So I think this was one of the few examples we could find of a third stair when we started this research. And it is exemplary in a lot of ways, but for many of the reasons Amanda just said, having that third stair go all the way to all the floors of the building is really powerful, both for the staff and for the residents.
So our fourth pattern is to include two exits from spaces that host one-on-one staff and resident interactions. And so you can see this tying back to the care principles of safety, sense of control, and choice, and these trauma-informed design principles of safe conversations, visual connection for safety and calming, and then, providing or promoting choices for social engagement. And what I, first and foremost have to say about this particular pattern is that this is the one that is most commonly requested by property management or asset management when we are speaking with representatives during our design phase. And I will say that this is, I think, an advocate for the importance of its use everywhere, in service provider spaces and property management spaces. But a lot of property management companies accept and acknowledge that they don't have the same level of training, as service providers do. And so I've worked with some organizations that don't feel as strongly about it for their service providers, but still really, really want to make sure there's two exits from spaces, where property managers can talk with residents, about conversations that might be more difficult, like lease violations, because the whole point of Housing First is we're trying to keep people housed. And so, most of the time when you're bringing that team together, you want everybody coming from the same place. But there are some more difficult conversations that are likely to happen with a project, property manager. And so, again, I can't recommend this enough. And I would say to, to those of you who are going to take this back to the designers in your room, it does take a lot of consideration, because offices are going to get larger as you want to think about having, access to those doors, and, and fulfilling accessibility requirements. So it's something to consider and to make a priority earlier on.
And it's actually just as important to do this in the common area spaces. And in some ways, it's easier to do because those rooms are generally larger. So getting a second exit into those common area spaces, whether they're formal rooms like a meeting room, laundry room, or if they're less formal areas like the lobby. And this is another example that I hope Amanda will speak to about being able to take a lesson learned from MLK and bring it into the NEL.
Yeah, I think this is actually one of my favorite lessons learned stories was, because we'd been really intentional, about two doors from a lot of spaces, whether they were, community rooms, private offices, and at the Commons on MLK, we had something sort of similar where we had a reception desk, and there were multiple ways out of the space, but there were pinch points, and it resulted in people sometimes feeling stuck in the ability to get out the main door if somebody was talking to somebody at that reception space. And so it came to light that having an extra exit from this lobby space would be really important so that you weren't always just having to go right out the front door. And so we were in construction on the Nell when we got that feedback, and we were able to, to think through, all right, somebody's here, and either they want to avoid the person who's talking to the property manager because maybe they have conflict, or they just don't want to feel pinched and stuck. And so we were able to introduce a second exit from that mail lobbies and entry lobby space that would allow for choice to head out of the building in a totally different way and potentially just steer clear of what was happening right by the front door.
Our fifth pattern is to create wide orienting circulation, which ties back directly to safety and sense of control. And in some ways, when we're in the conversation about PSH, I think we should say create wider, more orienting circulation. We all hope to create wide orienting circulation, but it often, the constraints of design, it often gets a little smaller, or you all suddenly have a funny blind corner in your building. And that can be especially traumatizing for people. And so in PSH, wider and more orienting would be the mandate.
So yeah, to Christina's point, long corridors and residential buildings, they can be very disorienting and feel confined. And so what we wanted to do is aim to provide a wider corridor, which is, not only allowing for social interaction, but it is responding to personal space needs and the needs of people with mobility devices. There's so much evidence that as people move into housing from a state of homelessness, medical health will catch up. And so there is an increasing prevalence of people with mobility impairments and using mobility devices in PSH. And so we wanted these wider corridors to also account for that. And as we were doing that, we're also trying to use distinct colors for wayfinding that are going to make navigating the building more intuitive, and then start to break down these residential floors into little bits of pods. We at the MLK project, we have 17 units per floor, and creating just little pods of 3 to 4 unit doors with these little bump outs kind of creates a little bit of a zone that feels more like a space that you're connected with your neighbors. And so the other thing that helps with orientation in these long corridor buildings is view windows at the end, because each of these windows is looking out to provide a different opportunity to connect with nature, and just a different specific view. In the case of the Nell, they're looking out at St. Mary's Church on one end, and a wall of arborvitae at the end, or at the other end. And so it helps people to be able to look out the window and have a better sense of where they are in the building as well. And then the use of these colored walls at the end where the windows are sending people toward the exit stairs. And then, this bit of color at the knuckle helps people understand where the vertical circulation are. So just being very intentional about the use of that color to help you navigate through space.
The last pattern that we're going to share today ties to collaboration and to empowerment, and also to the design principle of encouraging resident input for color, lighting, art, and furniture. And this is a pattern around future opportunities for resident personalization, self-reliance, and identity expression. And I want to emphasize the word future here. We're not always able to know who's going to move into the building. And it's very important that once people arrive and are moving in, that there are still opportunities for personalization, even in the common areas. And so this could be manifest by making sure there's a wall marked in the architect's drawings for art, future art, and make sure there's enough backing behind that wall so that something large that is chosen by the residents can be placed there. It may be as simple as priming a wall at the top of the elevator lobby or at the elevator lobby, priming that wall, but not choosing the color and letting the residents choose that color from a palette, a menu of options once everybody has moved in. So it's about making sure that there are opportunities for future personalization and identity expression.
And the first piece we're going to talk about is, how do you start designing when you don't know who residents are? And then Christine is actually going to get really into a slide that I think really is one of the best examples of how to create space for future personalization. What we're looking at here with the Commons on MLK on the left and the Nell on the right kind of remind me of a couple key things. First being, how do you design these projects to incorporate tenant voice into a new construction building? And at the Commons on MLK, we were able to engage with Eugene's local lived experience user group that serves as an advisory group to the city's poverty and homelessness board. And we worked with them during schematic design on the Commons on MLK, and got really excellent input from them then. So when it came to the time to make decisions on color and furnishing and art, the owner was able to reconnect with League to include this representative voice in the selection process for this new construction building. And at that time, also in the height of COVID, but I think generally asking this question, but at the time, a survey was a tool that was recommended by the lived experience user group as being effective to get their input on color palettes and the use and extent of color in certain types of spaces, as well as the furniture for common areas and units. And at the Nell, the owner was able to use tenant and resident feedback from the Commons on MLK to inform the Nell. And so one of the most important pieces that came out of discussions with the residents at MLK is that they felt like there was too much white on the walls, and it lent to this feeling of certain spaces feeling institutional. And even though, as somebody who works on affordable housing and is always trying to be as aware as possible about the balance of power of accent paint, but I felt like there was a lot, and my feedback was still like, we could do more, we could do better. So we were able to take that into consideration and incorporate the use of more subtle neutrals throughout the Nell, like this sort of soft blue on the first floor corridor wall, which was a direct response to that feedback. So, while it's also sort of just making this space to be able to improve as well. And Christina, I love it when you talk about these, because you've also seen so many examples of the way that even though the one on the left makes my heart sing of the Christmas decor at the Commons on MLK.
So the pictures on the right, you'll notice that the pictures that Amanda shows are all very nicely composed and very architect-y. So the pictures on the right are actually created by residents at 2 Plymouth buildings in Seattle using a GoPro camera and a video with on a chest harness. So they shot video for me of their apartments during COVID, but what I saw as they entered their apartment was this identity expression on the outside. So I think we always have to remember that the corridor is this really amazing liminal space between the public or semi-public and the private. And it is a space in which residents, especially after they've lived there for a long time. I will say this is not something that I saw when interviewing residents when they'd only lived there for 3 or 4 months. It was when they had lived there for several years, and how they were able to express their identity on the edge, basically, of the common areas, and thinking of the common areas as including the corridor, because it is a place where people are interacting with each other on a daily basis. So on the right, a photo collage at one of these alcoves that Amanda is describing. And then in the middle picture, again at the alcove, a much more composed, I would say, less exuberant, but still extremely intentional expression of identity. And so those little shelves in that building were placed there because many seniors live in the building. It was the idea of setting your groceries down as you were coming into your apartment. But I actually saw a lot of use of those as a place for objects, almost like an altar, right? Sometimes on the right next to the dwelling door. So thinking of that personalization, thinking of those opportunities to have a little bit of a transition between the dwelling and the common area.
Yeah, and I mean, we really love as a strategy at our office that subtle indent, the alcove in multifamily units. It creates such a sweet relief of off the corridor, especially if you're doing more of a minimum dimension, but more from the standpoint of introducing color, introducing a space to personalize. And at the Commons on MLK and the Nell, those very small unit size we had developed and those proportions didn't allow for that indent into the unit. And so these bump outs in the corridor themselves actually started to create that sense of an alcove. And while it's not at each individual unit door, you find places like that image on the left where people have just kind of owned that bit of space right next to their door. And then I think another one we need to get, Christina, is going into the Nell at the end of the corridor. I was showing those windows looking out to different views, and I remember walking through the building recently, and somebody had not only owned that space right out of their front door, but had put curtains that were held back with tie-offs that were like really beautiful, and some plants on that sill at the end of the corridor. And so just starting to make that space outside of their unit something even more beautiful, and that property management was supportive of that. As long as you're not disrupting anybody else and you're taking care of the plants, like, just go for it. And so keeping that space for personalization, that space for identity expression is just really, really important. And the design can do a little bit of that, but also, the way that managers manage the building supports that, and it's just as important, if not more.
So I think we'll end here so that there's a few minutes for questions from people. We can, if it's okay, we'll leave this slide up in case you missed it earlier, need to take notes, or want to ask us very specifically about one of the patterns. Thanks, JD. It's good to see you.
Yeah, this is a really amazing presentation, and it's such a privilege to have you here with us. Thank you so much, Christina and Amanda, for taking the time to share this information with us. I'm really excited to continue this journey with this group. We've been doing such amazing work, but there was something really special about the presentation and the way you guys talk about the clients and the importance of having client or creating spaces in which the clients can actually engage with the space and express their identity and all the things that everybody deserves. I really, really loved it. Thank you so much. Does anybody have any questions for Amanda and Christina?
I have a question, but especially it's kind of related to the net rental space versus common space. So obviously we're going to run into budget concerns of, how much you're able to do with it. And if you had to choose your top two principles, like what are the things that, like, this is the hill that we die on of what was presented. Are all of them the hill that you die on, or are there like some key ones that you think are really important for folks to focus on and try to make work no matter what?
Well, I will say, I think we're maybe done with the ice storm that we've had for the last few days here in Eugene, Oregon. So I'm not dying on hills. I'm just gonna say that. Amanda said the one that we hear the most from property management is to include the 2 exits. I think that is the last one I would eliminate, because technically speaking, it's so much less money than the value it creates. So it's a much easier business case. I can't emphasize how important safety is for staff and clients, and sense of safety. So not just safety, physical safety, but the sense that you're safe in trauma-informed design. So that's the one where it's really, I hope we don't go back to one exit rooms. I really do. I think it's yeah. So that's, for me, that's the one.
Yeah, and I think I completely agree. And then I think, like, as a second, just connecting, whether it's a light in the door or it's a window into a room, those visual connections between spaces, again, are not a huge leap. And they do cost money, but the ability to have a sense of what's happening in a room before you go into it is so important. And I think people being thoughtful can still make the most of, like when with the common areas and maximizing resident choice, Christina was showing great examples of zoning a single room to be able to accomplish a similar goal. And so, that's why I think, like, if we were on our pick two, the 2 exits and connecting those spaces with windows, that would be what I'd advocate for the most.
I would say, just from a case manager's perspective, just building on Amanda's point, that opportunities for passive interaction were crucial to my success to build relationships with clients and build trust. And because when folks move in, they might not need services right away, or they might not feel safe or comfortable right away, but to build a relationship over time so that when there is a lease violation or a behavioral health problem, you already have a strong connection, is what made me a successful case manager, so that they trusted me enough to work with me when there was a problem. So I think that visual, like creating spaces in which people can engage with each other passively, and it's not as institutional, and they don't have to come to an office, and they can't, like, there was a window in my office so they could see if I was in there. I had my door open all the time, but then also with the building staff as well, who are there 24 hours a day, like being able to walk by and say hi and how's your day. I think that is what makes these kinds of buildings really successful when we're serving vulnerable population from a housing first perspective. I will definitely send these slides out, Christina and Amanda. If you could send me a PDF version, that would be awesome. And then I have some other resources to share. But thank you so much, both of you. I know this will not be the last time that I ask a favor. I can already tell you. But I'll try to save them for really impactful moments as we're really building, a movement here to expand permanent supportive housing in our community. So and then all of you, thank you so much. I'm gonna fix the link, so you might see some weird calendar invites from me, since I'm not a tech expert. I'll probably have to do it publicly so you can all see my mistakes, but I'll send out an email with the new link. And of course, as always, feel free to reach out to me anytime if anybody has any follow-up questions or needs more information or just chat.
And we are not far from Nevada, so if you find yourself in Central Oregon, tours are available.
Yay! Oh yeah, that's a great idea. We are planning actually a field trip at the end of this series in November. I'm hoping to take some folks, somewhere to see some of these these high fidelity models. So maybe Oregon will be where we go, and it won't, but not in the winter. We'll have to check the weather. That would be amazing. Well, you guys have a wonderful, wonderful afternoon. It's so great to see everybody back, and Happy New Year.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much.